Hey everyone, this is Quentin Figueroa here with Crowd Freedom, and I'm going to talk to you about property. Now, property is a really important part of a free society. It is very foundational, and a lot of things, pretty much everything stems from it. So it's really important to kind of get an understanding of this and to explore property. So with that said, what is property? Why do we have property, and is it even important? Well, let's just look at something really basic. Okay, so is it okay to rape a woman? And pretty much everyone's going to say it's not okay. And the reason it's not okay is property. So a woman owns herself. Herself is her own property. And by raping a woman, you are initiating force on somebody else's property. So you can see already property already creates kind of a foundation for a legal perspective and for how law works in general, because law is based around property, and property is kind of the foundation of what we are as humans and individuals, because we are not a group. Each person is their own self-owner and their own property, and when you have a group of people, you are taking a collection of self-owners, but you're not actually creating your own. You're creating your own property, but within that property, there's an even more foundational part, and that is the individuals. So if you were to extract property down to kind of its most fundamental part, you have the individual themselves. And the individual is the property, because you own yourself. So, I mean, to break this down a little bit, there are kind of three main ways to look at property, and you can kind of run down three different things to see what makes sense of who owns something, right? So number one, you could say that you own the property. Number two, you could say that others own the property. And then number three, you could say that everyone owns the property. So let's take an example of a human. So say you take a woman. So let's go through all three options. Does a woman own herself? I think it makes pretty good sense that she does. Let's just try number two. Do other people own the woman? No, they don't. If they did, that would be slavery. If other people owned a woman, they'd be able to do things that she didn't want them to do, and that doesn't really make sense. And number three, if everyone owns a woman, then all women or all people own each other. And doesn't really make sense either. I mean, then everybody's kind of making decisions for everyone else collectively as a whole, and nobody can have their own individual say, and it's just kind of a mess also. So when you go through those three options of kind of what the possible scenarios are, in the case of a woman and just humans, the first possibility of you owning yourself makes by far the most sense, as it should. So that is something that is important to think about and understand, because in order for you to basically keep others from hurting you, you need to own yourself. Otherwise, other people are going to treat you like a slave or as they wish, and that is not something I don't think most people would think is reasonable or fair or right or anything like this. Okay, so this basically leads to the right of self-ownership. Now, we hear a lot of talk about human rights, right? Like you'll hear that it's a human right to have healthcare or to have food or shelter or a whole list of different things. And it's your yourself and the ownership of yourself, and you can't have rights when you are interfering with somebody else's rights. So let's take food for an example. If we were to say that food is a right, then that means that somebody is going to be receiving food and somebody is going to be providing food. And if people need to provide food because it's a right, then why would there be an incentive to provide food? Why wouldn't everybody just sit back and receive food? If it's a right, you could just sit back, do nothing, and food's going to be provided. But it's not, because it requires somebody to do the work. And people who do the work for food aren't going to want to give it away for free because they have to. Yeah, sure, people like to share, people will share, and people do share. But you can't force people to share because that's not a right. A right is the right to your property and yourself. But you can't force other people to provide things for you and call that a right. It doesn't make sense. It's not mathematically possible. So you hear about like healthcare being a right. Healthcare, it's not possible for it to be a right because in order to have healthcare, you're forcing another doctor to perform that task on another person. And by doing that, they are the one providing the service. And even if they were compensated through like tax dollars or something, you're forcing people to pay tax dollars to compensate them, to force them to do a service for somebody. It doesn't make sense. You can't force people to do rights. So if I were to create my own food and I grew it myself and I planted my stuff, I had a garden, I had some livestock and that kind of thing, maybe even I hunted, I'm providing it all for myself and that's fine. And it's property that I created myself that I own. But it's not okay for somebody to force me to give that to somebody else. You can't just transfer it that type of way. It doesn't make sense. So we'll kind of talk more about this as we go on. But yeah, that's kind of a basic understanding of how we own ourselves. And human rights are property rights. And property rights do not allow for kind of free goodies or things like this because it requires hurting somebody else to do that. And why would you want to hurt somebody? It's retarded. Okay, so let's say somebody draws a picture. So in conjunction with self-ownership, we also own the effects of our actions, right? So what we do is also our own property. And to say otherwise, like to say we don't own kind of our arguments or we don't own what we do or what we say, to argue against that is to take ownership of the argument that you're using to argue against that. And by doing so, you are arguing for property. So to argue against people not having the ownership of their actions, you're actually doing exactly that. You're taking ownership of the effects of your actions, of your speech, and that kind of thing. So of course, the effects of our actions we own. So let's take an example like you create a drawing. So who owns that drawing? Well, let's go through kind of the three options again. So you own the drawing, number one. Number two, somebody else owns the drawing, or a group of other people own the drawing. Or number three, everybody owns the drawing. Now, there's only kind of one scenario that makes sense again, and it's obvious. You own the drawing. You created the drawing. It's your drawing. So somebody else can't come in and own your drawing that you just created. And a group of people can't own your drawing. Yeah, you could transfer that ownership to them, but unless you do that, they don't own it. So you kind of choose how to manage that drawing because it's your property, because it's an effect of your action, and you own yourself and you own the effects of your actions. So let's do a quote from Ludwig von Mises real quick. And he says, "If history could teach us anything, it would be that private property is inextricably linked with civilization." And that is very true, although I think a lot of people these days might think otherwise. But private property is kind of a more civilized way to live than without having property. Whereas if kind of everybody shared everything, or it was more like a communistic type way or a socialistic type way, where kind of resources are just flattened and shared and that kind of thing. But by having kind of this difference in kind of effort and reward, and more of like a capitalistic property-based free market system, by doing something like that, you're allowing kind of the effects of people's actions, and you're allowing those effects to be allocated to them more efficiently. So people who do more will get more. People who create more will get more. People who do less will get less. People are the property, and what they create is being kind of returned to them in direct relationship to what they do. So that is kind of what Mises is talking about. More civilized societies are going to be very in favor of property because it is much better for civilization. And if you're familiar kind of with free markets and that kind of thing, you'll see how free markets and property rights and that kind of thing, they are much better at raising the standard of living. And that's why Western society in general is so freaking good right now, because over the last 200 years or so, the free markets have created tons of innovations and services and things that just make our lives that much better. But now we're kind of going the other way, which is kind of a problem. And that's kind of why we need to recognize what made our life so great and not fall into the trap of thinking that it's other things that did this, or that these things that made our lives great. We are confused to think that property and private property that made our lives great, we now think that it actually wasn't what created our high standard of living. And we think that we can have a high standard of living despite that. And it's pretty weird. So that's what Mises is talking about, and it's important. And it's important to understand that we own what we create, and that property is very important. When a company like Apple creates an iPhone or an iPad, they are creating property that they own. When Ford creates a car, they own that car. When somebody farms land, they own what they produce on that land. So everything comes down to property. And you can sell your property, you can transfer your property, and that's fine. But you can't force people through government or through taxes or anything like that. You can't force people to give somebody else their property, because you're violating their property by doing so. Okay, so let's talk about land, right? So land is another one that might kind of confuse people. You might think that's kind of a unique case, or it's kind of a gray area, but it's not. Land is property, and it's kind of the same thing. And you could go further than land. You could talk about the ocean, you could talk about a lake, a river, anything like this. Property is property. But so let's talk about land. So who owns land? Well, there are three options, right? You own land, other people own land, or everyone owns land. Now, if everyone was to own land, that becomes kind of a problem, because how do you manage that land? So, if everyone owns so first of all, if everyone owns land, that means all land would have to be owned by everyone. Otherwise, everyone doesn't own land. So in order to do that now, you're going to have some people that care about owning the land and some don't. And it's kind of weird, because you're going to have owners that don't care. So it's like other people who do care are going to use it more or take advantage of that. And it's like, why would you even do that? Because you're wasting the people who don't care. Why don't you just have the people that care own it and the people that don't care not own it? But moreover, how do you even manage that? How do you split up land between 7 billion people and say these people all own an equal percentage, and we have to figure out kind of how to get them to vote on how they want to manage it and use it? And it's stupid. If you were to do number two, where other people own land, but not you, that's a problem, because then how do you ever own land if other people can own land but not you? So you need to be able to own land. So again, number one has to be the way to go. You have to be able to own land. And yeah, it can be you plus others, but it can't be others without you, right? So it can be you as yourself can own it, or you within an entity like a corporation or something can own it. It's kind of the same thing, just a different way to look at it. But it can't be an entity besides you that owns it, and then you don't have a way of owning land. That's not a sustainable model, but it doesn't make sense. So we need to view land that way. And it's a lot of people with the free market, they talk about homesteading, right? So that's basically saying that the person who kind of discovers, or more so puts the land to use, that person is the one who owns it. So if there's an unused piece of land, and let's say it's an unused piece of land with a lake in it, and now I start, filling it with fish and fishing there and selling the fish and that kind of thing. So I'm claiming this land with the lake and using it for a purpose, and I'm basically, I'm basically making it property, and I'm creating effects of my property for other people to partake in, right? So I could sell the fish or do things like that, or let's say it's a piece of land and I just start farming on it. So I could start farming on a piece of land and now I'm using it for something. Let's say it's land and I create a home on it, right? So now I'm homesteading a piece of land and I have a home on it. So these are all uses, right? And so I'll talk about something too that I don't think is widely talked about as much, but it kind of ties in with the legal piece. So what is considered a legitimate use of land and what isn't? And that's kind of where the free market system of the legal side of things will come in, right? So society in general, for the most part, determines what the law and legal kind of normal things are within the society. And through kind of the way they support the court systems and the legal systems and how they vote with their dollars determines kind of what laws are and what is acceptable and what's not. And what's not acceptable will kind of be taken care of the legal way and that kind of thing. So anyway, so if somebody's using land a certain way, it would kind of be felt out by society whether or not that is acceptable use of land or not. So if somebody is growing, if somebody has a farm on it and they're, they have like a dairy farm and they're creating crops and different things, most people in a free society are going to be totally cool with this, and they're not going to bring any type of case or thing against them because they're getting benefits out of it and it's a great use of land. But if you have some greedy capitalists, which I know people like to talk about, and they were to maybe buy up or just kind of claim ownership of all the land, it's not going to be enforced through the legal system because most people in society are not going to deem it as a legitimate use of resources on that property. If they're just sitting there not doing anything so other people can't use the land, they're going to face a legal system which is a whole lot smarter than the legal system we have now, and they're going to say, you guys need to leave, you need to get out of here, this isn't your land, you're not using it in a way that society as a whole views as well because they vote for a good, smart legal system using their dollars rather than their votes. And there's, it's just a free market system is just going to totally dominate this area and make it so clean and so much better than the way it is now. But hopefully that kind of makes sense. But if you were to even, if let's say that some company came up and purchased like all the land in a free society, and they just totally owned the land, they didn't let other people use it, and it just wasn't fair, and there was nothing you could really do about it, and even if you wanted to use the land, you had to pay them some type of override, some type of fee to use the land. If we had that, that would be probably a problem, and it would probably be a good idea to do something about it or to kind of create a better system if that did happen. And that's what we have now with government. Government owns all the land, and they decide who can use it and who can't, and for what use and what use they can't use it for, and whether it's residential or industrial or commercial, or if you can build a building this high, or if you can do this, or if you can have mineral rights, or all these crazy things. Government decides because they own all the land and we don't own the land. And when we do buy the land, we still don't own the land. They own it, we pay them a fee to own it because they own a allodial title and we don't. We never truly own land in America or any other government-ran society, which is pretty much everywhere in the world. So if you don't want to have somebody owning all the land, then you don't want to have government because that is the system where somebody owns all the land. So a free market system with a free market legal system and a free market property system and all these things are going to create a much better use of land. And yeah, it's something to understand. Okay, so, and yeah, government is obviously terrible at managing land. And that's, it goes to say that anybody who owns property is going to treat their own property better than somebody else who owns it. So, your own car that you own, you're going to treat better than you would somebody else's car or something else. That's just how property is, and that's how people are. People take better care of their own health than they do other people's health. You care about yourself. You care about your own property. Anything you do, any property you have, you take better care of and you do better on. And that's why the free market system is so effective, because the free market system is property, and it allows each property owner to use the property to the extent that they want. So people that want to do something well with their property will, and people who don't, they don't have to, and it doesn't matter. But with the government system, it works the other way, where you don't have direct property owners making decisions and management things for their property. You have a group of other people who really don't care, but they just do it. So it's just a mess, and it's obvious. So yeah. Okay, so now in order to have property, there is a second part to property. Because if you own property and somebody can freely take your property, then you don't own it. So in order to own property, you have to have what's called the non-aggression principle. And this basically says that somebody cannot aggress against the property of another person. So this is why when a man rapes a woman, that it's wrong. Because a woman is property and somebody else is aggressing on that person's property. So that's wrong. So that's why you have the non-aggression principle. You cannot initiate force on somebody else or somebody else's property. So if I own an iPhone and somebody aggresses on it and steals it, then they are violating the non-aggression principle and they are violating my property. And that is kind of, so if you don't have property and somebody can just freely take my iPhone, then you don't have property, and it's just, you're back to kind of a non-property system, whatever it would be. But if you do have property, then that means that you own it, and in order to own it, you have the right to defend it. You have the right to create the boundary for what your property is. So if somebody were to come and try to rape a woman, because she owns herself, she has the right to respond with force on that person, whatever it would be. She could, it kind of depends, and the free market court system would kind of determine what's justifiable and what's not. But if somebody were to come and try to rape a woman, she could probably shoot them or, use a knife on them, or she could obviously fight back if she could, who knows. She could have a defense agency, a private company, like a security agency that basically kind of protects her, that type of thing. There are lots of ways where a woman could defend herself in a free society, and it would be totally justifiable. And because of that, it would help violence and crime and all that in general, but that's kind of a different topic. But yeah, so you have the right to defend your property. If somebody tries to murder you, you can kill them and use self-defense on them, and it's justifiable. Now, obviously, there are kind of gray areas, but that's where courts come in. If somebody were to let's say somebody were to pollute, your next door neighbor was polluting on your land, you can't go and shoot them because they're polluting on your land. That's taking it too far. And courts and society in general will kind of determine what's too far and what's not. And I think that would kind of take care of itself. It's not that complicated. But I mean, it kind of depends on what's going on and how you respond to that as far as self-defense goes. But you can use self-defense in a free society. It totally makes sense. And that's the only way to have property, is to be able to defend it. So that's why the non-aggression principle is so important. So if we have, and by the way, so the non-aggression principle is also, it's great because it's universal. It doesn't matter what race you are, what sex you are, what age you are, any of this. It doesn't even matter if you democratically vote to use force. It's still not okay to initiate force on property in a free society. So it's a very universal principle type system. And that's a great thing because it makes it a lot easier to kind of know what's going on and how to rule on things. It's not kind of an arbitrary opinion like a lot of laws are now. It's just you can't initiate force. It doesn't matter whether 1 million people vote to use force on something and only 10 people don't. It doesn't matter. You can't initiate force. It doesn't matter if a certain race says this other race is bad. It doesn't matter if a gender says something or a certain age wants to use force on another age group. It doesn't matter because you can't initiate force. So it's universal, and universal things are usually very, very good. Okay, so if somebody were to create an iPhone, right? So let's say Apple creates an iPhone. There are 2 ways to get that iPhone to somebody else. So you could do it voluntarily or involuntarily, right? And one obviously is using force, initiating force, and the other is not. So if you were to voluntarily give a phone to somebody, that could be done a number of ways. It could be done through the most common way, which is like a commercial transaction where somebody buys it from you and you hand it to them. So if Apple says this new phone's $500, somebody says, I'll give you $500 for that phone, then they exchange, and totally voluntary, no initiation of force used, so it's a valid property exchange. And yeah, so that person values the phone more than their $500. Apple values the $500 more than their phone. So there's a trade, and that's pretty much how free markets work. Now there is an involuntary way, which is where Apple creates a phone and somebody goes there and steals it from them. Now this is a violation of Apple's property rights, and that is not allowed. That is an initiation of force by stealing it. If somebody were to go, they were to come there and point a gun at them and say, hand me that phone, that's a use of force. So they are violating Apple's property rights. So there are involuntary ways to do things and voluntary ways. And we, in a free society, focus on voluntary ways of doing things, because that is the way to where everybody can have the most freedom and the most choice without hurting anyone else. And that's the goal of a free society. And that's why property is so foundational in a free society. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a rudimentary understanding of property in a free society, and I hope that kind of possibly maybe even answers a few questions you might have had. But yeah, so is there ever a justified time to initiate violence? I would leave you with the question, is there ever a justified time to initiate rape? So thanks for listening, everyone, and have a great day.